put my feet up with you, Marie.
Marie was a practical nurse working in the evening shift at the old Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx. The city only paid for registered nurses on the day shift. Not that the patients weren't in completely capable hands with Marie. She was a sharp Jamaican dust storm of a woman, tiny, wiry, and astoundingly energetic. Most evenings, the ward hopped like a nightclub with one demented act. She sang, she scolded, she exhorted, she divulged. She was an efficient Pied Piper, sucking those 6 people right out of themselves, away from broken linoleum and army green cloth partitions and the disinfected stench of the open ward. On Maria's shift, the junkies were so entertained that they gave up their usual pastime of knocking the roaches off the curtains.
Pretty quiet in the ward tonight, Marie.
Yup, chores are done, everyone's tucked in. We can rest our feet for a little while.
I was sweating in the heat of the New York night, but she was starchy and crisp as usual. Maria's voice was as quick and precise as her body, accompanied by the whir of the fan, the fleas buzzing, and the chanting. Always the chanting.
I'll call them my singers, the ones who go to their death, not groaning, not screaming, but singing, coaxing death with a chant of gates, gates, gates in the sky, or wash the baby, oh Lord, wash the baby, or cloak and scrubbing, cloak and scrubbing, cloak and scrubbing.
The 3 old women chanters were placed one on each end of the ward and one in the middle. Marie always prepared them for the night by smoothing their pillows and straightening their sheets, as if they were still aware, and they just kept on crooning their way into death, putting the rest of us to sleep. Marie started talking to me about her son.
That one, my Jamie, he's smart. He put himself in law school. Oh my, he's going to be something. He always was a crackerjack.
Is he married?
Oh, sure. And the first little one on the way. Imagine me, a grandma.
Maria, don't you have another son?
Yeah, honey, I do.
What does he do?
I don't know. I haven't seen him now. 2 years it will be. I lost him young.
She sat absolutely still.
Lost him to what, if you don't mind my asking?
Lost him to the streets. Jamie, though, now you should have seen him in high school. Wasn't he the sharp one?
I didn't ask any more about the other son. In that silence, the paging began. It started innocently. First,
ER chief to the emergency room.
Nothing much to wonder about that. Then,
Security personnel to the emergency room.
and then,
All senior doctors to the emergency room.
finally.
All doctors to the ER stat. All doctors to the ER stat.
I jumped off my chair and looked at Marie.
Not you, honey. You're a medical student.
But what's going on down there?
Whatever it is, you best stay here. You'll be the only kind of doctor we got up here now.
All medical students to the emergency room stat. All medical students to the emergency room stat.
This time, I tore down the hall, my short white coat flying. There was no safe place to leave things at Lincoln, so when you came for overnight duty, you brought everything in your pockets. Coins, notebooks, ophthalmoscope, pens, syringes, and Tampax came jumping out of my pockets as I rounded the stairwell. I clutched my pockets and tried to glide. As I came down the last hall, I could hear the emergency room, yells and screams, and a general chaotic chorus. I charged into the waiting room and stopped dead. Wooden chairs had been overturned. The middle of the room was a twitching mass of muscle and skin, with a pause provided here and there by a knife blade, a chain, an ice pick. I had seen knife fights in the waiting room before, but the scale of this one was staggering. Kids in studded leather jackets going at each other. One boy's jacket had Death Lord spelled across the back. On the floor were 2 clumps of doctors and nurses trying to resuscitate bleeding bodies. The audience to all of this was the arriving relatives and girlfriends, some in torn jeans, some in cheap business-like suits, some dressed for a night on the town. They were crying and reaching from the sidelines. I stood paralyzed by the entrance. One of the guards spotted me there.
Go on through to the treatment area.
Without thinking, I plunged through the spectacle and found myself in the treatment area. Here things were much the same, except there were more bodies lying flat with people working on them, and fewer still upright, causing damage. A surgical intern grabbed me.
Put your hand here on this man's neck to stop the bleeding.
I did as told, but as I stepped closer, I let the pressure slack a second, and a hot shower of blood sprayed over me, soaking into my whites, splattering my face. I pushed harder, and it stopped. Then an arm brushed my shoulder. I turned with a jump to see the chief resident on duty that night. He was shouting something at me. I grabbed a nearby hand and pressed it on the neck wound, then followed the chief resident.
Medical student?
Yes, sir.
Need you to ride an ambulance. Supposed to send an MD, but we can't spare any. You'll have to go. Go out to the bay. We'll bring the patient.
The night air was a shock, dark, cool, and quiet. An ambulance sat there, back door open, ready to receive. The driver leaned out, an unremarkable man. He pulled the pipe out of his mouth.
You the doc?
Yes.
He nodded contentedly and disappeared again into the dark.
Hey, medical student.
A nurse and an orderly were wheeling out a stretcher. A still form lay on it, gleaming in the night. I ran over.
Here's the papers. You'll have to bag them.
He handed me the bag. I had never used one before. I squeezed it as he had, forcing the air down the tube into the lungs. He turned to walk away.
But where are we going? What am I supposed to do?
Keep him alive if you can. Gotta get back to the ER.
The nurse and the orderly lifted the stretcher into the ambulance and rolled the patient onto the narrow cot attached to one side. I was moving with them, trying to squeeze the bag in a kind of breathing cadence. I had never paid much attention to breathing before. They closed the doors of the ambulance, and I was alone in the dimly lit back. The frail papers of the temporary chart were barely readable.
What does this say? Transport unknown male to Jacobi Hospital for neurosurgery. Bullet wound to the head.
I looked down at him. He was 18 or 20, motionless aside from my breathing for him. His face was serene, as if he had lost deep sleep of childhood. The top of his head was bandaged, but there was no other mark on the smooth skin of his body.
I wonder what his name is.
The ambulance started. The siren went on with a deafening wail, and we shot out of the hospital bay. The violence of the ride surprised me. I was barely able to keep my balance as we swerved through the dense traffic.
Keep squeezing the bag. Keep squeezing the bag.
I kept telling myself, but I was frightened. The light inside the ambulance flickered with each maneuver as if it was a faulty connection. Then disaster struck. A car cut in front of us. The ambulance driver veered suddenly. I went flying and landed with a crack against the glass of the rear doors. I turned to look for the boy. I called him Angelo.
Damn.
He had slid off his cot and onto the floor and was turning dusky blue.
Driver!
But nothing could be heard over the noise of the siren. Panicked, I straightened his body and smoothed the pillow under his head. I forced a sudden, rational calm.
Think. Reason this out. He's turning blue because he doesn't have enough air. Give him air.
I tried to squeeze the bag harder. Nothing moved, so
The tube is blocked.
I looked at the tube. It had been pulled out when he fell, and the end was stuck in his mouth.
The tube isn't in the lungs. The air isn't going in there. How am I going to get air into his lungs? Oh, Angelo, stay alive. Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. I'll just keep it up till we get there.
I yanked the tube completely out and pulled back his jaw. We were still sliding back and forth across the floor of the ambulance as it jerked and turned, accelerated and stopped.
Okay, I learned this. I can do this.
I did it. I didn't notice that we were there until they opened the back doors, flooding the ambulance with the neon lights of Jacobi's emergency room. The light hurt my eyes, but I didn't dare stop breathing. I just stayed where I was, breathing into Angelo's mouth. And a minute later, an ER nurse tore me away from him.
My, what a picture you look.
She pulled me out of the ambulance.
We hear you had a real gang war down there at Lincoln.
Yes.
I was still dazed. My mouth was coming out of numbness into bruised stinging. I touched my tongue to my lips, feeling their swollen strangeness. Angelo was being taken off by the trauma team.
Why don't you go get a cup of coffee? Bobby here will wait for you. Won't you, Bobby?
She looked up at the driver. He nodded calmly, pulling on his pipe.
Sure.
I went in. Some of my medical student friends assigned to Jacobi drifted around me, trapped by my bloodied whites like a small animal frozen in the headlights of an oncoming car. They made nonchalant conversation about trauma and gang war and other things we didn't understand. I barely heard them, the roaring darkness filling my ears as if I had crossed from another world and wasn't quite back into this one. When I tried to go to the cafeteria, one of the aides stopped me.
You look disgusting with all that blood all over you. You can't go around people like that.
I looked at him.
I need a cup of coffee. I have no change of clothes with me.
But in the well-lit hospital corridor, I knew I was inappropriate, wearing so much blood. I went back out to the ambulance and climbed into the front. The driver looked at me.
Got some coffee?
No.
People are like that.
We rode back quietly, smoothly. When we pulled up to Lincoln Hospital, he said,
Got another call. I'll just let you off.
I slid off the seat and jumped to the ground.
Thanks. Doesn't it bother you ferrying people back and forth night after night?
He must not have heard me because he didn't answer. The ambulance took off, leaving me standing there alone. The next morning, I stopped by Jacoby on the way to Lincoln. There was no sign of unknown male on the neurosurgical ward or in the recovery room. I asked the clerk at the admitting office.
Nope, can't find them listed anywhere. Usually, when they disappear like that, it means they died before they could get properly admitted.
When I got to Lincoln, the head nurse on days stopped me in the hall. She was an old friend of Marie's.
So I hear you rode the ambulance last night.
She was a large woman, and she looked down at me without smiling.
Yes.
Folks at Jacoby told me that you were giving that boy mouth to mouth when you got there. That's a good way to get all sorts of disease.
She paused for a minute, as if she were going to say something more, then turned to go.
Remind me to teach you how to use the ambu bag sometime.
Something of what I was feeling must have shown on my face because she suddenly frowned and grabbed me by the shoulders.
Do you think you should have saved him? Who do you think you are? Better that you tried to save that boy's life, not just in 1 minute in the end, but year after year after year, and you some white girl gonna come down here and make everything all right in a few minutes?
She was trembling now. She pushed by me and ran down the hall. I saw Marie later that night. She was smoothing down the pillow for one of the chanters, the one with breast cancer. The old woman was out of her mind and didn't notice, but Marie was smoothing her pillow and pulling up her blanket anyway. I walked up to her.
Anything else you need before I go to dinner?
I heard about you riding that ambulance with that boy that got shot.
Yeah, well, I didn't do much for him, did I?
I tried to turn away before she could say anything more, but she was too fast for me. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out some dog-eared Polaroids.
Here, let me show you something. My new grandbaby, just born last night. Isn't she beautiful?
She smiled like the moon breaking loose on a cloudy night.